This is the Small Town Big Talk Show, the only place where you can listen in on real life conversations about the challenges and the joys of living in a small town. I'm your host, Rebecca Undum, and each week a guest will join me as we tackle one topic that more than likely we're all feeling or have thought about, but of course, no one wants to talk about. Let's chat. My guest on today's episode is Cassidy Johnston. She is my virtual assistant. She lives in a small town in New Mexico with her cowboy husband and her two little boys. Cassidy is in beef advocacy. She is a sustainability officer with the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. She's also the only female rep for Leachman Cattle of Colorado. She is a bull and semen rep. She's the area rep for New Mexico. So Cassidy and I hop on to talk about, she grew up in a big community. She's from Colorado originally, grew up in town. That's what she calls it, in town. And we talk a little bit about how transplanting to a small town where you came from somewhere larger can be tricky to navigate. That's the idea of the small-minded, and it's not because of ignorance, but it's because their world is smaller. Their worldview is smaller. We talk about how tricky that can be in a small town, not only for ourselves as people, but especially in raising our kids. So lots of little tidbits to take away from this one. Can't wait to hear what y'all think. Happy listening. Cass, sister, how big is the town that you're currently living in New Mexico?
I think it's roughly 12 to 1,500, but we do live 30 miles outside of it. So we're very rarely like in that town, but it's little.
Okay. So, and along with that, like one of my things is like, how far are you from a Target? You're far, far from a Target. Yeah.
60 miles from Target.
Oh, that's not so bad.
50 from my door to Starbucks. Two different towns, but I did measure that the other day.
Okay. Well, that's not so bad. I mean, that's under an hour. You can get there in under an hour. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, okay. Yeah, you're rural. You were more rural when I first met you, though.
Yeah. When we lived in Corona, we were 90 miles from Target.
Yeah.
So 60, 65.
It's a good day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you because I always love talking to transplants because I just think that's a different set of challenges that come along. And in your specific case, like I'm for the benefit of our viewers, I want to make sure people understand how you and I met. We met via the internet, via the interwebs. And I love, that's the thing. I think that we're in a weird world where it can be really hard to figure out, like, can you make real friendships? Can the internet be a safe place for good things to happen, or is it all just burn it down? And, because seriously, it can be pretty ugly, right?
Yes.
But you and I went into a Facebook group that we were both a part of for rural women. And I was basically like, I'm looking for a VA. And I was looking for an assistant, like straight up an assistant. And you posted like, too bad she couldn't be virtual. And I'm like, oh, she totally could. And then here we are. Like a year later, and we're working together, which is so much fun.
It is. It's
what I also love about you is your passion for agriculture. You are in the beef industry specifically, and we don't necessarily need to get like deep into that, but that is why I think your take on small town living is so interesting, because neither you nor your husband Bert are originally from the community that you're living in, right?
Right.
Okay.
And for scale, my high school that I graduated, 4,000 kids went to my high school. So my high school is bigger than this whole town.
Right. And you're originally from Colorado? Yeah.
Yep. Denver.
Yeah. Yep. So that's some serious culture shock. So when you and I were talking about what we discuss, and again, like I always say, like, no people were harmed in the filming of this episode. Like, I take seriously that there clearly are benefits living in a small town, but at the same time, there's struggles. And sometimes figuring out how to highlight those struggles without making it sound like everybody's terrible and everything is terrible, sometimes that can be tricky. So that's just the blanket caveat statement right now that neither of us are saying that it's all bad, right?
No, not at all.
But there are times, I think, and again, you came from a bigger community. I was in a bigger community before I moved back here. And then it sometimes feels like your mind and your heart and your thoughts about things have opened a bit or were opened. And then you come to a place where maybe people haven't traveled outside of that community, or it just feels overall like everything's a little bit like the worldview is just a lot narrower, right? And a lot smaller. So what has been your experience? What's like, and how is it showing itself for you, and just all the things? Just tell us about kind of what you've experienced specifically as a transplant, because it's super tricky.
Yes. And to be honest, I didn't notice it quite as much until we moved here, because New Mexico does have a different, the state kind of has its own culture, but I think it's partially a perfect storm of, we have kids now. We've lived here for a year and a half for reference, and I have a 4-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. So 4-year-olds like have a brain. So now we're navigating play dates and parenting styles. And then I think part of the reason it's kind of feeling a lot is because of politics. And rural people tend to be pretty passionate about politics. And I always kind of have been, it's a little bit different when you're older and you're voting and you have money and like all these things actually matter to you. But when we're talking about political issues or agricultural issues sometimes, or engaging with people in town, because that's something we do talk about a lot, is how do we talk to people in town about what we do? Because all of our friends here are ranchers, just like us. And that's a big question. And it's kind of a center of part of my business life, is talking about that. I realized that growing up in town has really afforded me just a bigger worldview. I grew up with kids of all religions, of all skin colors, of all orientations. We were able to I'm fluent in French. Like, that's weird, right? It should be Spanish. Awesome. It really should. But like at my high school, we had 90 clubs, like anything you wanted to do, you could. And then I went to school in Boulder, which is a very progressive, not always in a good way. I mean, I will full disclosure because I got interested in ranching when I went to school and college, and that was hard. But just having that exposure and being able to form my own opinions based upon conversations with other people, like, oh yeah, that sounds really good what you just said, or like, I'm not sure I agree with that. And I'm also lucky that my very best friend in the whole world is currently an athletic trainer at Wellesley in Boston. So she lives completely different. We are on 2 different ends of the spectrum.
Right.
And so we kind of she'll tell me about something and I'll be like, yeah, here's the other side of that. And then when I start talking, she'll be like, well, but. So I have this really grounding presence. But I've noticed that a lot of people I meet in small towns maybe don't have that. The difference is they have deeper roots than I do. They have maybe a bigger sense of community than I do. Obviously their families have been here for generations, which those are all great things. But I think sometimes it's hard when you've seen something different. Like, it's one thing to talk about entire groups of people never having met them before.
Right.
And when you grew up with a lot of them, how they like to put it, it's like, well, no, but they're people too. And it's given me such a great perspective for my advocacy work with beef. Yeah. Because sometimes people talk about people in town like they're ignorant. It's like, no, they just don't know. I was that person. I know how that feels. Like, it's not ignorant. It's just that certain people are exposed to different things. Right. Like, a lot about farming and ranching, but have you ever met a person of this religion? You haven't, and that's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's just the way things are. But the problem comes, it's what's that quote? There's a quote about, I forget, but just not knowing. People are scared of what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think sometimes fear of the unknown causes people's minds to just snap shut. And that's hard. And it's hard too, because you don't want to raise kids. Like, I love the idea of raising my kids on a ranch where they learn responsibility, they learn community, they learn that they are just a small piece in this big world, but a piece that matters. Like, I wouldn't ever give up their rural upbringing for anything. But I think we're going to have to work really, really hard to help them meet other different kinds of people with different opinions. And the way it manifests itself, I think, is we've lost the ability to talk to each other.
Uh-huh.
And I'm a big talker. I love a nuanced, kind of difficult conversation with my friends just for the sake of arguing. And I don't get that here. And sometimes I'm worried that if people know what I believe about certain things, they won't like me anymore.
Right.
And you can't afford to lose friends. It's like a miracle when you find people that you get along with, whose kids are great.
Right.
You can't just go get new friends. You can't. Like, this is all the friends.
Right.
And at the same time, it doesn't make them bad people either. Like, they're just the greatest people, but they maybe are not as tolerant of. And because you don't want to be like they're intolerant. It's just a difference. It's just one of those things that you're kind of like, no, I don't know how to navigate this.
Right. So what have you personally tried? Because you and I have talked about this a little bit. I worry in my small town. I would say cultural diversity is a really big thing for me, where everybody mostly looks the same. We do not have a lot of diversity. And so I definitely worry about, how do I help my kids, specifically my kids? Because, like, I went to college, and I still went to college. I went to college in North Dakota. So it still wasn't.
I went to college in Boulder.
Right. It wasn't super diverse, obviously, but there was some diversity. And I truly did not feel like I went to college and was like, oh my gosh, it's an African-American person. Seriously, like, I don't feel like I felt that way. But, you go, like, if I go to Minneapolis, for example, and I'm like downtown with friends or whatever, it becomes so much more apparent, like, how I am not surrounded by a lot of diversity. And it isn't anything I can help. Like, I can't help what the makeup is. So what are you, like, what are your thoughts about that? What are you going to intentionally do for your boys? Because I also am guessing that there's not a ton of diversity in agriculture. I guess I don't necessarily see that,
It's funny here. The further south we go, we are actually a racial minority in some parts of the state, because there are a lot of Hispanic people here, which I think is great for my kids to see, that there are more colors of skin in the world than our skin color. Like, right. We do look a little bit different than a lot of the people the further south we go, because we are 180 miles north of the border. So, which brings its own set of political discussion.
Yes.
But I think what we do, I've made an effort to buy books that show lots of different things. We watch movies with different kinds of people. And, when I hope someday we can travel a little bit more. And thankfully, Denver, where both of our parents still live, is becoming extremely diverse. And my parents' neighborhood is really diverse. So we have neighbors of all different skin colors, and that we still are really good friends with. So we're really lucky in that sense. But I think our plan is to kind of actively help our kids understand that the world is a very big place, and you're one person in the world. And especially in ranching, because ranching is predominantly white Christian people. Like, people don't like to put a label on it, but that's typically what is in cattle ranching. It's not anybody's fault. It's not for a reason
And it's not a
necessarily.
problem even.
No.
Right? That's just it. Like, right.
Yeah, it's just what it is, and that's fine, but it does make it hard. And we also talk about in terms of women, like Lacey has toys that have girls in them. Like if we buy, he's really into Thomas the train right now.
Yep.
So he has some engines that are girls. Because I don't want him to have an antiquated idea of what women do. It's not like that in our house, but it can be that way in certain communities. And so I think you just have to kind of be cognizant of it and be proactive. And for us, what we do at home is what we do at home. Like people's opinions around us don't influence what we do in our house.
Right.
But I think it's just exposure. Like you have to work overtime in small towns. Like it's extra hard.
Yeah, I think so too. And so, okay, so that's the one aspect of it is how do we help our kids? Because it's the kind of stuff I think about a lot, because obviously they're not, well, they may come back here. And that's something too I feel very passionate about. I don't feel like small towns do a good enough job of saying like, you could actually move back here and have a decent living, right? Mm-hmm. It's always like fly, little bird, fly, and don't ever come back. I don't necessarily feel that way, but I do think getting them out and having them experience something is really good for them, right? So there's that aspect of it, but what about you as the mom, as the woman? Like, how has this impacted you? Because to some degree, what I feel like I'm hearing you say is that a lot of times small towns become their own echo chambers where everybody thinks the same. And so new ideas from outside of the little pod or whatever, new ideas don't come in easily. And if they do, how do you feel? What are they met with? I'm like, so how has it been for you? Because I mean, you're a newcomer with new, fresh ideas. Yeah. How's it been received?
Full disclosure, I have not talked about a lot of tough stuff with my friends. Like I don't necessarily agree, but when they're talking about stuff that I know is going to get sticky, I legit leave. I will go find Lacey. I will make sure I will go clean. Because my filter runs out at a certain point and I don't want to lose these friendships.
Right. Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes too, with that echo chamber also comes the inability to have a conversation and not associate disagreement with lack of compatibility in a friendship. Which is something we're really going to teach our kids. Like, this is how we have a debate, kids.
Yeah, this is what discourse looks like. Right.
Yes. Respectful. And I just wrote a blog post about this because this is something I'm also struggling with. You must be kind always. And so when I know there might be a situation in which I may be led to be unkind, I try to leave it, like physically leave it or get on my phone. Like sometimes I'm rude in other ways. Sometimes I try to agree but disagree, I agree, but on my side, this is, and kind of make it funny. Like, all of these defensive tactics that we have.
Right.
But, mostly I just try to keep my own brain happening. And thank God for the internet in that way. I am friends with like Facebook groups, kind of keep me a little bit honest. I have one that I very lovingly call the hippie Facebook group because my cousin invited me to it, and most of my family is extremely liberal and raises, it's an interesting situation, but not an unwelcome one. But she invited me to this group, and it's pretty, it's full of people who march for women and are professors at East Coast colleges, like a whole completely different. But the thing about that is, like, I've told people about that group and they're like, that sounds terrible. Yes. But when they're talking about stuff that I know about, when they're talking about food or when they're talking about, I can help. I can be a resource for that part of things.
Right.
But also sometimes, because mostly it's this is my problem, please help. and you get lots of different advice and all that stuff. And it kind of makes you, it keeps you in check.
Yeah. I think this is interesting because it really is. We've talked about this with a few of these different talk show episodes, that like, just because you've seen other things in the world, bigger community, what have you, it actually doesn't give you the right to do anything with it. It feels like, but I've earned the right. I've earned the right to tell you guys about these other parts of the world. But unfortunately, it takes time, and trust is what allows us to have those conversations. And we have to also just realize that people may never really want to hear how everyone else, how other people are thinking about it. And so the whole thing, I think, for us is just, if you are wired to want to be open-minded and, be compassionate and be empathetic and hear two sides of a topic and all the things that we've been talking about, then you have to be really intentional about cultivating it in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's important to you to raise your children that way, that you have to be intentional about it and recognize that it's not about changing other people. Right. And that it never, ever is about changing other people, even though there are times, it'd be great if we could get people just to see that if you weren't being so narrowly focused, you'd see where I'm coming from. But all the same, we don't get to do that. It's not how it works.
Well, it's a different kind of diversity in and of itself too. Different kinds of families who believe different things. And, we focus a lot on believing different things on the more accepting side of things, if that makes sense. Like, we talk about different people, but sometimes you are going to have interactions with people who aren't super, it doesn't make them bad people. Right. And so that's part of the diversity, is saying, hey, they may not really be down with this book or this movie. And it's something we have to walk our children through, because I think there's a lot of kids and a lot of young people too now who don't necessarily know how to deal with that end of things, where someone is not bad, they just think differently. But there are people who I don't know, I'm being clumsy about it, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a different kind of, it's just another kind in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And it takes all kinds of kinds. It's just another one of them. And I think people kind of forget that those people are people too. Like,
right.
Small-minded people are people. Like, they're just people. We're all just people. And you're never, some things that I struggle with a lot with beef advocacy, which is all advocacy. You're never going to convince someone to come around to your side or listen to you by yelling at them, by making them feel small and ignorant. You're never going to do it. It's just, that's not how you convince people. If you set out to convince somebody, you're probably not going to convince them.
That's the big picture, right? Like, we don't win people over through, the convincing that's not in any of our jobs. It's not your job. Like, I get, even as an advocate, you would think, it's your job to convince people. No, it's not. Your job is to share consistent, reliable, proven, correct information. Present information, share it. Be open about it. Be honest. Yes. Yep. And that's the big takeaway, is just like you said, even small-minded people are people too, which I think is really funny, because, it's like, obviously, but at the same time, it's so easy to say people shouldn't think like that. But as soon as you do that, you're being as bad as you're saying they are, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah.
People only know what they know. Everyone has like a set of experiences and a whole lifetime that sets them up for how they look at the world. And like, my dad is an example of that. My dad's never lived anywhere but here in the small, the square mile or whatever my small town is, and the farm that we live on. He's never lived outside of this. And so I have found myself getting really frustrated with him at times. Like, I'm just like, oh, Dad, like, you have no idea. But then that's what I have to tell myself. Like, he actually has no idea. And if he doesn't want to learn about it, it's not my job to educate him on how everything should be. It's not my job. I think this is also where boundaries come into play for all of us, because you can love people where they're at and know what the limits of
of the relationship have to be so that you can still love them, right? Not necessarily with my parents, but like with friends, you know that certain topics, like you just may never get to a point, and maybe you will, but you may never get to a point where you feel like you can just honestly have that conversation, especially if you stand in opposition to a way that they think, because it'll wreck the relationship. Well, yeah, that's a boundary that you're putting in place. And does it suck? Well, sure it does. All it means is they're not deep inner circle friends. Like your friend in Boston, she's one that like, she knows all of it. Like she knows everything. And you guys maybe still don't agree, and that you're like good with that. That's different, right? But it's that levels of friendship thing too. You've got to be smart about it. Because
and I think you need to know your triggers too. I kind of actually hate that word, but like,
but it's a real thing. Yeah. Because I think that's the other side of this, is that like I want my kids to be compassionate, and I want them to be all the things we were talking about. And I want to be that way too, but I want to feel secure in my beliefs. I want to feel secure in what I know to be right. And I want to teach that to my children. So being able, I mean, it's almost, sometimes it feels like you can't have both strong beliefs about things and honor other people's. I feel like that's kind of where we've come in this weird world that we live in, where it's like, and honestly, it's Brene Brown's book, Braving the Wilderness, again, where she talks about like, you're either with me or you're against me, or you're for me or you're against me. And that's not true.
No,
I can disagree with you and still be for you.
Right.
It's
not
an actual thing.
There are very few zero-sum issues, like true, honest zero-sum.
Right.
And helping our kids learn that nuance and compassion, it doesn't make you a doormat. And sometimes it is the way to get what you want. But like one of my favorite quotes, which might say a lot about me, is that Winston Churchill tact quote, where he says, tact is the ability to tell someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. Like, is there a more British quote?
Right. No. Well, okay. So you're going all the way back to like my roots of when I became so like fascinated with personal development. It was because of Dale Carnegie. I worked with Dale Carnegie, and he wrote the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And
my grandpa sent to me when I was 12, by the way.
Way to go, Grandpa. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But that's what it's all about, though. It's about their people skills. It's human relation skills. Like the only way to get what you want is to the only way to get another person to do what you want them to do is to make them happy about doing it. Like that's one of the quotes in his book too. Kind of the same thing, right?
Which is true.
It's, and for some reason we've completely lost the ability to do that. Completely.
And yet we talk about dictatorships in countries like they're bad. Well, it doesn't work on a small scale either, though. Like it doesn't. And that's another thing that we really want to teach our kids. And I think it's one of those other perfect storms of online. Kids don't know how to look at each other like we are big on looking at people in their faces and shaking their hand.
Us too.
Like, I don't care if you don't know that person. You need to do this thing. They order their own food. Well, Lacey does. Buster doesn't speak. He has to order his own food at restaurants.
Right.
If he wants something, he has to ask for it. And so I think we have this perfect storm of people, urban places are starting to be more the same in certain ways, maybe more racially and ethnically and religiously diverse, but the thoughts are starting to be the same. And then you've got rural America here and things. I mean, the Trump election showed us that there is a huge split between rural and urban America. That's just the truth.
Right.
So then you have that. And then you have children who are being brought up with internet and phones and screens all the time, and where everything is automated. Like listening to Lacey yell at Alexa is the funniest thing I've ever heard. But then I'm like, oh my God, but I love Alexa. Like we make them tell Alexa thank you, because you can't just order Alexa around. I'm making sure Alexa didn't hear me. And so that's part of it too, is you have to, it's teaching critical thinking skills and teaching kids that, because it really does, like you can see it in how people write online. we've lost our critical thinking. Like watching Facebook conversations, which is why I'm not as active on social media as I would like to be, because I can't stand it. I'm working on it, but I can't. You see people who are otherwise loving, nice people completely lose their minds on the internet because there's a screen in between them and the other person. But then it bleeds into how they interact in real life. We're just full of quotes today, but I think it was Mother Teresa who said, like, the best thing you can do for the world is go home and love your family.
Right.
Like that's good work. And in small towns, it can feel so small and you can feel so stuck. But like just loving your people well, keeping your minds open at home, talking about all kinds of weird, tough stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And because I find myself getting really down on people, and the world doesn't need more unkindness in it. That doesn't mean that some people suck. Like some people just, they suck.
They suck. They do.
It takes all kinds of kinds, and so one of those kinds is just suck.
Right. Well,
but at the same time, you can take a step back and you can say, okay, I don't love her the way she's delivering this message, but God, she is one of the most giving people I've ever met. What a generous person she is.
Right.
Or, you can find, and not just like, she has great hair, but like something that's really good about their heart.
Right.
But like, where has the reality check gone? Like, I think the internet has something to do with that. Which is why I think sometimes small towns are more susceptible to that, because a lot of, like I said, a lot of their news and their interactions are online. But we've lost, I'm looking for the word, but just the sense of what is real and what matters and what is not.
Right. Right. So I think it's a good place to actually end this discussion, because I'm going to go back to my dad for a second. He watches a lot of Fox News. Okay.
So do my grandparents.
My dad's conservative. And yeah, so he watches a ton of Fox News, and it does sometimes, I think, slant his viewpoint to being quite cynical, because they tend to be looking for kind of the injustices, especially, just the whole political climate. It's like, what injustices can we highlight in the world and then like blame the Democrats or whatever,
And the reverse. It happens on both ways.
Up being so cynical and angry and like the world is going to hell in a handbasket and blah, blah, blah. Right. And I sometimes have to say, like, but you live 110 steps from me and my husband and our 3 little kids, and we're all healthy. And we're like influenza A right now, but like typically, we're healthy and we're well, and we're, sometimes you honestly do have to just be like, okay, like shake off. That's why it's important to sometimes ask yourself, am I inserting myself too deep in the middle of all of this? And that it's actually making me lose perspective on what I have, like what's really happening. There's the world, and then there's your world. And yes, we're a part of the world, but we have to just keep our minds and our eyes and our hearts set on what's right in front of us. And so, like, going back to the Mother Teresa quote, go home and love your children. That's how we do good in the world. Yeah.
And it's, that relates really well to the bigger political idea too, that talks about, we're going to hell in a handbasket, but you guys, we still live in this, like, I'm not about to go make America great again. I'm not. I actually hate those hats. I can't explain to you why I hate those hats. I just do. I hate words on things. Like, why do we need all of these words? But it's like, you guys, we still, like, even though stuff can be hard, even though we are not perfect, we still live in this place with all this cool stuff and all these great people and all these amazing opportunities. And that's still true for small towns.
Right.
You might live in a place that you feel is backwards and small, but you still live here. Like, you still live in a place where you're free to do, most things.
Right.
We can make things feel real bad, but then when you just walk it back a little bit, you're like, okay. And I think also you have to surround yourself with people who think that way.
Right.
To kind of check in with. Like you have your friends that you call when you need to be angry about something, and then you have your friends that you call when you're like, please tell me why everything doesn't suck. You know?
Yep.
So yeah, and you're one of the latter, by the way. You're a everything doesn't suck person, which I appreciate.
Everything doesn't suck. Sometimes things suck, and sometimes you gotta just like have that out and feel feel your way through that. But it's when, like you said, it's when it feels like everything sucks and you really don't feel even marginally positive, where you're like, okay, I need, like either a change of scenery or a change of perspective, or I need to disengage from all of this for a little bit. Yeah. All the joys and challenges of living in a small town.
It's so great. It is. It is really fun, and it does add an interesting little element into things.
It sure does.
I'm glad I live in a small town. I wouldn't change it. I mean, I would put a Starbucks a little closer, to be honest.
Me too.
Or just a good coffee shop, just somewhere to go and sit down.
Well, I have that. I have that in my little town, so I can't complain. I can't.
We don't have anything in our little town. We do have 2 good restaurants, which is more than you could ask for.
Right. That's good. That's good.
Restaurants and a good grocery store. So
thumbs up.
Could be worse, right?
Always.
Everything
It always could
suck.
be worse.
That's what I say all the time. I'm like, it could be. When my mom used to always say that to me, and it drove me nuts. And I'm like, well, but it's true. Like, let me tell you, everybody, how it could be worse.
It could be worse.
We'll end on that uplifting note. It could be worse, everyone. It could.
So you're a transplant, living in a small town that wasn't originally yours, and you are constantly reminded that you are not one of them. And you're wondering when you're going to stop feeling like an outsider. Grab your copy of the Small Town Survival Kit. It was designed just for you as a transplant, and it will help you feel less lonely, less isolated, and a little bit more inspired while you're waiting for the acceptance of who you are as a person to come around.